Religious freedom doesn't just happen. It has to be created. You have to have people who push for it and are able to explain it to others. So if you treasure religious freedom, this is something worth talking about. If everyone is able to freely speak their mind on the topic of religion, what you will get is a society that is supporting each other.
On In Good Faith, we believe that all faith traditions have something to teach us about how God is working in the world and in our lives. So join us as we listen and learn and discover how speaking with people of other faiths can strengthen our own faith and even our own practice. Today we're talking about heroes of the American Revolution. You might think of George Washington or Thomas Jefferson, John Adams or Crispus Attucks or Colonel Ty or Phyllis Wheatley. But our guest today introduces me to Jewish patriots of the American Revolution in his book about the birth of religious freedom, called A Promised Land. And he's also going to share how thinking about religion led him to a further engagement with religious life. Adam Jortner is professor of religion in the Department of History at Auburn University. He specializes in the history of religion in the American Revolution and the early nation, with particular emphasis on religious liberty, patriotism and piety, theology, and new religious traditions. He's currently researching Canadian religious revivals in Nova Scotia.
I was working on a different project about Judaism, and I was like, well, let me read it back to see what was going on around the revolution, thinking that I would find lots of anti-Semitism, the Jews not getting a fair shot. And I found exactly the opposite. The American Revolution actually increases opportunities for Jews, lets them achieve citizenship right off the bat in the new United States, and actually allows them to serve in the military and even as officers, which is something Jews couldn't do in Europe for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. I mean, not since the Roman Empire. By and large, the American Jews support the revolution enthusiastically, and the revolution sort of supports them back. And this is one of the pillars on which full citizenship, religious citizenship, is created. It's one of the pillars on which we build freedom of religion as we understand it in this country.
You talk about how religious diversity served the nation.
Right, and let me be clear what I mean here. The founders are not all Christian. They do not require people to be Christian, and they even do what Christians didn't do in Europe. They promote Jews to officer status. Jews get elected to public office in the early years of the American Republic. That had never happened. It couldn't happen in Europe. And the story of, well, this is a Christian nation made exclusively for Christians is really something that people start to come up with about 50 or 60 years after the revolution. And again, let me be clear. Many of the founders are devout Christians, but if you think America begins in the revolution, then we have to accept that it was religiously diverse. And actually, that religious diversity worked for the United States. In fact, it's more likely that we won the war because of that diversity.
You even mentioned a battle in South Carolina where what was called the Jew battalion of the militia, 28 of the 40 soldiers were Jewish in that particular battalion.
Right. Beaufort still has now a strong Jewish community, and they turn out to serve in the militia. They're nicknamed the Jew Company. They called themselves, however, the Free Citizens. They didn't think of themselves, well, we're Jews fighting for America. They said, we're Americans. We're free now. This is our responsibility as citizens, as members of the Republic. And that's a big shift because in the colonies and throughout the European Christian world, Jews are not citizens. They're not subjects. They're residents. They don't have the same rights as a Christian does. And the revolution flips that.
Well, so many questions. But I'd like to know, is there some document or thing you learned in the research or the writing process that really had the most impact on you?
There is a book that contains all of the constitutions of the early American states. And that book was printed in 1783. We still have the copy that the people at the synagogue Mikveh Israel of Philadelphia bought and annotated. And again, the Mikveh Israel is a really important synagogue because there are only 5 cities with a synagogue or with a Jewish community: Savannah, Charleston, Philly, New York, and Newport, Rhode Island. All those places, except for Philadelphia, are knocked over by the British by 1778. So Jews who are patriots, who want to continue to live as Jews and who can afford it, go to Philadelphia. And that's different than what Christians have, because Judaism, you need some stuff, for lack of a better words. You need to have a Torah. You need to have a space that's been blessed. Methodists, Baptists, Protestants, they just go anywhere. You see what I mean. The Jews go to Philadelphia. They refound Mikveh Israel as a national patriot organization. They create a board of trustees that is created from all over the country, and they create a national Jewish organization. And then when the war is over, when they've won, then they go in and they take this book of constitutions and they begin to go through to determine what are the rights of Jews in each of the states. And they make little marks and they make little notations, and we still have that. And looking through that, I began to see, these early Americans were not just interested in a vague sense of religious freedom. They were serious about it, and they wanted to say, we have served, we are equal under the law, and therefore we should have the same religious rights. And in every state that has a Jewish community, all the test oaths fall away. And of course, a test oath is a constitutional agreement. You have to swear to believe something, not just, I will protect the state, I will fulfill my oath of office. Usually it's something like, I believe in the Old and New Testaments. Sometimes if you want to exclude Catholics, you have to say, I believe in the Old and New Testaments, but not the Pope, that sort of thing. And of course, these were used to keep Jews out of public office. And again, what's remarkable is there's test oaths in almost every constitution in 1776. Within 15 years, every place with a Jewish congregation, every place where it would have mattered, that goes away. And again, the Jews are not, it's not the voting power of the Jewish community here. They're like 1/10 of 1%. There's a tiny minority. It's about how American patriots in the Revolution thought about religious diversity. They might not agree with Judaism, but they wanted to create a democracy where what someone believed did not stop them from serving in office, where citizens had the right to determine for themselves how they would or would not worship God.
Well, there are a few really interesting characters that jumped out to me, and I want to ask you about some of your favorites. One, just sort of in passing, when he joined the Revolutionary Army, Elias Pollock, he decides, well, I don't know how they're going to feel about Jews, so he joins under the name Joseph Smith, which within 50 years would be problematic in different ways for him. But there's a particular name I'd love to ask you about. He's sort of known because of what he does in Philadelphia, you say, as the Rabbi of the Revolution.
Yeah, Gershom Satius. He's a really fascinating guy, and technically there's no rabbis in the early United States, because to be a rabbi, you have to go to yeshiva. And as you may imagine, there are no yeshivas anywhere in the New World in 1776. So what Gershom is a hazan, which is to say a sort of community leader, but he functions like a rabbi. He becomes the head of the New York congregation, and then 1776, Congress calls for Christian ministers to offer a day of fasting and prayer. And Satius decides to join them. He didn't feel that being Jewish was a barrier to have him have a day of fasting and prayer at his synagogue to offer up prayers to God along with his Christian fellow colonists. And then a few months later, independence is declared. The British Army is bearing down on New York. Satius takes one of the Torahs from the synagogue, and he and most of his congregation head out to Connecticut. They're going to live in exile. There's no real threat that the British are necessarily going to come in and shut down the synagogue, so they must have been moving for patriot reasons. And to go to Connecticut at the time, I mean, it was maybe the least Jewish place in all of the colonies. I think Hartford had a Jew street, but it didn't have any Jews in it. So they went to a very Gentile place and they set themselves up in exile. Eventually they head down to Philadelphia, where he becomes the Hazan of Mikveh Israel. And ultimately, it's Gershom Satius who sort of leads the way in bringing Mikveh Israel to petition for Jewish rights. When there is a big celebration of the passing of the Constitution, Gershom Satius is selected to walk in the parade with the rest of the Christian ministers, and people are like, wow, this is great. Look at how America is burying the arguments of the old world in its new republic. And indeed, at the end of the parade, when everybody stops for lunch, there is actually a kosher table reserved for Satius and for the Jews.
Wow.
So again, Jews are not a big part of the population, but people are aware of them and they go out of their way to make sure that the Jews are included, that there is going to be not just religious toleration, but religious freedom.
I think you mentioned it was at the rededication of Mikvah Israel that they actually have a dedicatory prayer. It's in Hebrew, but the beginning letter over on the right spells out line by line, starts with the letters Washington.
It's actually made in Richmond by the New Richmond Synagogue. The early Jews loved Washington, and they spell out in Hebrew letters Washington as one of their dedicatory prayers. And of course, they make sure everybody knows this. But again, one of the critical documents in American religious freedom is the letter of the Newport Synagogue to Washington in 1791. And Moses Satius, Gersham's brother, is the head of that synagogue. And they write to President Washington and they say, "We have been denied the rights of freemen, and we are hoping that this new country of yours will give to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance." And Washington writes back and he says, "You're absolutely right. This is a government that gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance." And indeed, he says, this should be a place where all we ask is that you demean yourself as good citizens, and we're not going to check your religious qualifications. I should point out, when Washington is writing to small religious minorities, he's very fulsome. When he writes to the Baptists, they were small then. Baptists or Catholics or the Swedenborgians, he has similar effusive language. We want you, we're glad you're here. When the big denominations like Congregationalists or Presbyterians write to him, he's a lot more circumspect.
This is In Good Faith. We're speaking with Adam Jortner, religious historian of the American Revolution. You can hear more interviews with other religious historians in episode 102 with Elaine Pagels, episode 154 with Thomas Albert Howard, and episode 187 with James Goldberg. Find all of our episodes on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. Be sure and share an episode that's meant something to you with the people in your life. Now more from Adam Jortner. I'm curious about your background. Growing up, was yours an observant house?
Well, I was raised in a Jewish household, insofar as any household in Southwest Virginia can be a Jewish household, which is to say, reform-minded. My father came from an Orthodox background from Brooklyn, but he got work in far Southwest Virginia, so that's where we went.
Did you go to synagogue on a regular basis, or was it more of a cultural identity?
What a great question. One of the things I teach about is that often in the United States, a Jew from Council Bluffs, Iowa, and a Muslim from Council Bluffs, Iowa will have more in common with each other than, say, a Jewish person from Detroit or a Muslim person from Detroit. Which is to say, anyone who's in a religious minority in the United States often has similar experiences. We had a synagogue that we went to, and we went pretty faithfully, pretty observant of the holidays, but we also lived in a world where the cheeseburger is there, but you can't have it. So I did have a Jewish upbringing, but it was in some ways sort of catch as catch can. We did not have a regular rabbi growing up, but I felt like I got a fairly extensive Jewish education. I learned to read Hebrew, that sort of thing.
Did you have, as a young person or as you've traveled along through life, a sense of a reality of the divine or of God and some connection?
Steve, for me, the reality of God is something that I thought myself into, which is to say, I'm highly skeptical of experiential religion for myself. I do not deny that other people may have experiences of God that I haven't had. But for me, I struggled with my faith for some time. I struggled with the ways in which many religions, not just Judaism, but many forms of Christianity as well, often felt more exclusive than inclusive, by which I mean I would often feel like I was being tested. Whenever I went into a holy space for worship, I felt like there was a certain standard that I was supposed to hit. I became a Christian after about 20 years of studying it. So, it was the long game. And ultimately, I think my faith came about after I thought about it for long enough. And I always had told myself that I ever came up with a reason for belief that would be good enough for me. And to me, what is convincing about the scriptures is the message of Christ, which is to say, I have not yet met another religious prophet who talked about forgiving your neighbors and who says the problem here is not about good versus evil. The problem here is about asking God for forgiveness, which is to say the proper response is to say, Lord, forgive me, have mercy on me, a sinner. And that is the reason why I believe in the resurrection. I know for many folks that will sound weird or that will sound impossible, and I'm okay with that. There's nothing super dramatic about my story, but it was sort of coming to really sort of understand the life of Christ that I came to believe in the resurrection.
Because you do work and teach as a historian, how is that tied to your faith? Or what effect has that had? Or is that what had brought you to study the things you do?
I mean, I think being a person of faith makes doing history a little bit more challenging. One thing that I believe is that people don't believe things because they're true. And this is one of the great mysteries of life. Because again, if you think about it, if people only believed the things that were true, there would be no disagreements in the whole world because we all would have seen whatever the right idea was. And then we go forward. So as a historian of the church, I don't think it's my job to go around and say, Tom was right, and that's why people followed him, and Sally was wrong, and that's why people didn't flock to her. What you have is you have a world of people who are trying to understand different religious ideas and are searching for the truth. The history of the church is not a history of truth necessarily, because again, you can say Jesus Christ was the same yesterday and always, but the church has changed. The church is a human institution. And so what we do when we study the history of the church is we're studying the ways in which Christians meet the world. And what we are looking for is ways other people have thought about God. And I think we're supposed to take those very seriously and very carefully. For many centuries, the argument is, well, if they were Christian, they must have been a good person. And let's find out ways that Christians were successful. In these histories, the Christians are successful by killing a lot of people. There's a really old book called Ecclesiastical History of Britain by a guy named Venerable Bede. It's a great book, but he talks about how this one group of Britons, they got baptized and they were still wet, and then they won a big battle. And he, of course, says because they got hit with the water, that gave them the power to win the battle, which is not, I think, consistent with what Jesus says in the New Testament. But the goal here is to sort of think about that and not to sort of go around and being like, this person's a Christian, therefore they're good. Because Christianity has as one of its fundamental tenets that we're all bad. We're all going to make mistakes. And anyone who has spent any time in any kind of Christian institution will know that Christians fail repeatedly and sometimes magnificently. That failure doesn't make the religion untrue. But it is something that I certainly think helps us to realize that people have believed different things in the past. That the story of the church and indeed the story of the United States isn't just us in funny costumes. That they really believed in different things. Baptists used to be ferocious about drinking alcohol. And as someone who teaches at an SEC school, I feel that that is not as strongly emphasized. There used to be enormous conflicts between Protestants and Christians over what exactly happens in the Eucharist. I'm going to go out on a limb here. Most American Protestants and Catholics could not tell you the difference between a Lutheran point of view and a Catholic point of view. And that's not a criticism. It is just to say these things used to be much bigger issues, and now that has turned around. And I think one of the most important Christian lessons is to remember what Christians have considered to be good and evil. The positions we take are not consistent through time, which is not to say there's no such thing as good or evil. But it is to say you can't justify what you're talking about just by saying, well, this is what Christians have always believed. To me, I think that is an important piece of faith because it teaches humility, and in that humility, to remember to be courageous. It's not courageous to say, I believe something everyone's always believed. It is courageous to say, I believe this, in spite of the fact that there might not be thus and such supporting it.
You know, if I look at stories of the revolution, finding accounts of the women, other than perhaps Abigail Adams, because of her famous correspondence with her husband, is a little bit hard. But you do feature several women in this book. I wonder if you might tell a story about one of those.
There are a number of women in the Revolution who really affect and transform the American Jewish community. There are also some non-Jewish women who I get to in the book. Just have to point this out. There is a woman named Deborah Sampson who actually dresses as a man and fights in the Revolution as an Army Ranger and is later celebrated for this. And she spends a lot of her life after the Revolution going around proving she can put a rifle together and all sorts of interesting things. Now, in terms of Jewish women, there are a number of ways in which religious freedom transforms their position, and they, in turn, transform religious freedom. And one of the most important is Rebecca Gratz, who is born during the Revolution and lives about 60 years in this first sort of era of religious freedom for Jews. One of the things religious freedom does for Jews is that for the first time in centuries, Jews are finally able to respond to Christians. Because, of course, in Europe, Jews literally were legally prohibited from saying anything critical about Christianity. That would be blasphemy and you could get killed. Under conditions of religious freedom, Jews are actually able to respond to Christianity. One thing Rebecca Gratz does is she begins writing works for Jews and specifically for Jewish children that emphasize this is what Judaism is and this is why we believe it. She begins to write what are called apologetic works, which is to say defenses of the faith, which can be used in all kinds of synagogues. And she actually finds a way to produce these things, get them printed up and sent around to synagogues. There are also a number of women who get involved in sort of staking out defenses of religion. Rachel Mordecai is an interesting one. She becomes very prominent in Jewish and Christian circles for responding to Jewish stereotypes that she sees in literature. Jews are presented, as shysters and as evil landlords. And she says, look, this isn't the way we are. And her letters about this begin to get published and circulated. But again, this is something that is happening in Judaism that couldn't happen before, which is that Jews are able to write their own defenses, their own thoughts on religious faith.
Adam, this book is really enlightening and brings so many new faces and new stories to the idea of the history of the revolution that I haven't known. I'm sure I'm not alone in that. Any last thoughts about what religious freedom is and how unique it was with its beginnings? And how do you see that playing out today?
Religious freedom doesn't just happen. It has to be created. You have to have people who push for it and are able to explain it to others. So if you treasure religious freedom, this is something worth talking about, and not in sort of a reactionary way, but to sort of say, if everyone is able to freely speak their mind on the topic of religion, what you will get is a society that is supporting each other. Again, differences of religion are not going to result in civil divisions. So I think that's a lesson for us today, is that it is a positive good that has to be worked for. One more thing that I would say about religious freedom is that religious freedom is one of our most valuable things. If you can't convince someone without the power of the state behind you, you're not really preaching. If you offer someone, hey, you can be a U.S. senator if you take this oath, or we will not shoot you if you take this oath, you're not really converting people. But having said that, religious unfreedom is something that is also taught. I get into some of the sources of anti-Semitism, but one thing that is true is anti-Semitism is learned. There are books about anti-Semitism. There are books with anti-Semitic ideas. Same thing is true for anti-Mormonism, anti-Catholicism, Islamophobia, which is to say there are people who are organized to spread misinformation about people's faiths, to say these religions are not real religions, they are plots against you. And it is incumbent upon the rest of us not only to condemn these things, but to point out why those are not true, and to make the case that different faiths make us stronger, even if we don't agree with them. if we have a place where a Muslim can worship freely and a Hindu can worship freely and an evangelical Christian can worship freely, and we can work together. And that does not mean that Islam and Hinduism and Christianity are the same. It doesn't mean that they are all theologically true. It means that if religion is a private good, then people will join because of what they believe, not because of what the state has to say. It behooves us to sort of keep an eye on that. And this is very important in our own communities. I say this all the time. It's great if you have a screed you want to release on Twitter. It's even better if you hear someone saying something or referencing something that tells an untruth about someone else's religion or tells an untruth about religious freedom, to answer them and to speak freely about that. That's way more important than getting angry online.
Many thanks to Adam Jortner for speaking with me. This episode was produced by Heather Bigley with Nick Levitt. Our production team also includes Heidi Clough and Ocean Marshall. Our post-production sound designers are Mark Hansen and DJ Cromarty. In Good Faith is committed to the idea that we all benefit from hearing people of widely varying backgrounds share their personal experience with faith and belief. In fact, we think people with such experience deserve some of our best listening. You can check out more of our episodes and extended interviews on our YouTube channel. Connect with us on Instagram and Facebook at In Good Faith Podcast. In Good Faith is a production of BYU Radio. I'm Stephen Cap Perry. I hope you join me again soon, right here, In Good Faith. You know, there are no perfect people, and there are no perfect families, and no perfect relationships. So how do we be good people and have good relationships and good families? How do we do better at what is most important to us? I'm here to tell you about The Lisa Show, another in the family of BYU Radio podcasts. Lisa Valentine Clark is a comedian, a believer, a single mother. She delves into the challenges and the relationships that shape all of our lives, whether we're talking about parenting, mental health questions, social issues, being a caregiver. She and her council of moms tackle the topic. Yes, you'll hear from experts, but you'll also hear from the people who have been digging the trenches. She'll help you figure out this thing called life with lots of laughs along the way. It's The Lisa Show. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.